All right then. So, in case anyone is not aware, Casey stepped down as from the tech lead of RGW a few months ago, and Adam Emerson and I are now splitting those duties. And so I've never run one of these meetings before, so we'll keep things flexible. If I'm doing anything wrong, feel free to say something. And we'll just kind of walk through the agenda and see if anybody else has anything to add to the agenda. I believe Casey has posted in chat. Let me view it here. The link to our pad, which has our shared notes here. All right. Anyone is welcome to add something to those as we start. And I guess I'll just continue. So the first section we have is expanding interfaces. D4M caching has been enabled by the layering model that Zipper provides. So I assume we're going to integrate that more deeply into RGW. And maybe I'll just ask Casey, do we pause and see if anybody has any comments for each of these, or how does it generally work?
Yeah, maybe if there's a knowledgeable person that could talk about each thing just briefly. For D4N, we had a meeting yesterday and discussed planning a little bit. Some of the things that we came up with were finishing the read caching and the write back cache, and also cache distribution. And I think it's reasonable to get all of that stuff working for the T release.
Was there any thought of having ephemeral data in the cache? So data that doesn't actually need to be stored permanently, but would be helpful to keep around. Or until it's evicted.
I mean, that would be possible. It also may not be necessary depending on how you've just got your settings on your write back.
Uh-huh. Okay.
As long as you delete it before it's written back, then it was ephemeral, right?
That's true, yeah. So it might be nice just to have it never write back, and then just, if it needs to be evicted, it'll just be evicted. So I'm thinking in terms of things like Aeroflight information, which we don't necessarily want to store permanently. It's generated to do a request, and then we would keep it around for as long as we have it. And if we lost it, we would just regenerate it. But okay. Does anybody else want to speak to D4N caching? All right, the next one is, I added this. I wasn't sure whether Gal had any intentions for further S3 select enhancements. And is Gal here? I do not see him. So we may want to just remove this until we know positively that Gal has something to add here. Does anybody else want to speak to S3 select? Okay, maybe I'll just mark it with some question marks here. The next thing is Aeroflight. We want to add further enhancements to Aeroflight. Currently, it's just a very basic interface. But I've been working on that off and on for a while now. And we want to be able to even process flight SQL requests and maybe channel those through S3 Select and enhance it in that manner. So maybe I'll add some notes here.
Eric, will it be possible to have some sort of a demo for what we support with Aeroflight?
Yeah, probably that's probably best for after the next stuff is merged, because right now it's relatively basic. But sure, that would absolutely be possible.
Thank you.
All right. Would anybody else like to speak to Aeroflight? All right, so now we go to resharding, and there are 3 items here. The first is reshard log. Who would like to speak to that?
This is the same PR as the minimally blocking reshard. And I think that you've been doing a lot of testing on that.
Okay, I see that's the same PR. Okay, I didn't quite recognize it from that. Okay. So yeah, for those who are not familiar, we've had an upstream contributor provide a new kind of reshard implementation where we do not block on the first phase of reshard. As reshard is happening, all changes to the bucket indices are logged, so they can then be replayed during a second phase of resharding, and that minimizes the window in which write operations to the bucket index are blocked. We even have ideas that maybe we would expand that and do a second round of logging and things of that sort. But I did some testing on this PR, and what I found was that while the average latency over time is slightly increases, the maximum latency is significantly lower. And so that prevents timeouts and things of that sort. So on the whole, we think it's a good trade-off. And through all my testing, it's been bug-free. And also, Mark Cognan, who I think is part of the call here. I saw him. No. He has also done some additional testing at scale of it. So we're excited to move forward with it. Would anybody else like to speak to that particular item? All right. The next item is shard concurrency. Going to remind myself what this is. Are you able to speak to this one, Casey?
Yeah, it showed up at about the same time as the first PR with a different optimization that just adds parallelism because we have to process each shard. Doing that in parallel is going to make it a lot faster overall. And so these are kind of 2 different independent optimizations that I think we want both eventually. So we're focusing on the reshard log one first, and then we'll adapt that to get concurrency where we can.
Right. So the initial version of the shard concurrency one is it would only come into play once the number of shards were doubled. So if you started off at 11 shards and we're going to 22 shards, due to the modulo operation, each thing in shard 3 would ultimately be mapped to the new shard like 6 and 7 or something along those lines, or maybe it's 3 as 3 and 14, whatever. So, but we weren't actually sure that aspect of it was necessary. So we'd want to test it in cases where we're not doubling and seeing whether there are any issues there and whether we get the same speed ups. All right. Would anybody else like to speak to that one or add anything to the resharding section? All right, so moving on to the multi-site section, we have the bucket index log.
Hi, Eric.
Sure.
So I wanted to know, like, for the QE, so if the PR, if there is any documentation for the resharding for the changes, we would like to have that and also test.
Okay, so are you referring to either of those 2 optimizations, or
yes,
first one?
Yes. Yeah, for the resharding optimizations, I think this is the first one was for the non-causing or minimal reshards, right? So
correct. So
yep.
I don't know. Oh, I don't know if there's any documentation. Like, it doesn't change. Well, no, actually, you're right. it does actually add some RGW admin commands, as I recall. So, yeah, we'd have to point you to those so you could test all of those out. Okay, that seems fair. I'll add a note here for that.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Moving on to multi-site. The first item there is a bucket index log offload to FIFO. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I know Radislaw was working on it, and Matt was interested in reviving it, but I don't know the current progress. I know there's someone working on it, but I don't quite remember who.
Yeah, Shilpa is planning to revive this.
Shilpa, thank you.
Yep, so kind of restarting at the design phase and making sure that we cover everything, and then revisit Radix PR and take the pieces that are useful.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. The next item I grabbed from 2023's meeting notes is replication scrub. Does anyone know if that's still on the table?
So our Bloomberg plan to put some effort on this. I wonder if anybody else in the community are doing this. No? Then yeah, just we're gonna start some effort on this. We haven't started yet, but we plan to.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else? All right. And the last item in multi-site is fix and re-enable all the multi-set tests that were disabled for Squid. I know this has been something you, Casey, have been very interested in doing.
Yeah, and if we're going to take on more development, especially like the BI log offload, then it would be really nice to have good test coverage first.
All right. Would anybody else like to speak to that one? Okay. Moving on to Zipper, the first item. Oh, is there anything else in multi-site I should ask before we move on to the next section? All right, moving on to Zipper. The first item there is Zipper loadable modules that Caleb has been working on. And is Caleb here? I don't see him.
He's on PTO right now.
Got it. Is anybody else able to speak to this item?
I mean, progress is happening.
Okay. The next item here is flexible configuration for multiple filters, and that's has your name on it, Daniel.
Yep. So this was started by Ali before he left, and I picked it up. Basically, it will allow us to do arbitrary stacks / trees eventually of filters and stores for Zipper.
And that's all just be a runtime configuration.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, obviously, you'll have to have built all the filters and stores that you want to load, but in combination with Caleb's loadable modules, it will be able to load the correct modules for each filter or store you want to run. Before loadable modules gets in, you obviously have to have them all built in.
Got it. Very cool. Okay. Anybody else like to speak to that?
Maybe a quick question, Dan. Is there a specific use case in mind for one of those combinations, or an example? Or
I mean, it's just finishing the feature, right? The current config we have right now was always a placeholder, just so that we could test stores and filters. But if you want to be able to use, for example, D4N and POSIX right now, you will need 2 filters.
Okay.
Okay, anybody else want to speak to that or add a new item to the zipper section? All right then. So the next section is just kind of other than didn't seem to glob onto one of the higher level categories. The first there is S3 bucket logging. Would anyone like to speak to that?
Yes, I would speak on that. This is taking an AWS S3 feature where you record like all modifications and access to a bucket as rows in objects in a special log bucket. This is the nature of the feature. It's not going to follow exactly the specification from AWS, because the first use case that we have in mind is to use this as a kind of a bucket journal that could be used for S3 backups. So to have all the changes or modifications to a bucket listed as objects in a different bucket. But so this is like what is planned for the release. Maybe in the future we will try to match all the functionality that exists in AWS S3 just for completeness and for other applications and uses for other people.
Okay. Would anyone else like to speak to that or ask questions of Yuval about that? Okay, the next item then is the large objects dedupe. Who would like to speak to that?
Yeah, that would be me. It's a project aimed in enabling dedupe, but it's only applicable for now for object larger than 4 megabyte. I'm using the same concept that we do for server-side copy, which is copying the manifest from the source to the destination and then removing the object reference by the target manifest. But for now, it's only going to benefit object with more than 4 megabyte, because the first 4 megabyte are embedded in the head object, which we need to keep because of the attribute. There's going to be a Gen 2 project separating the head object from the data, and then it's going to be more beneficial or more useful.
Yep. I have a comment on that. Generally, you can have head objects with 0 size data as it is. Like
yeah, I know. We have them for multi-part object. And when you have multi-tier, and sometimes they want to have the head object on the fast tier, on the fast device, and the data is on the slow device. But I think if the dedupe would prove useful, then we might want to do it all over the place. And I know Yuval is also working on another scheme, breaking the head object from the data.
No, this is just the way that the bucket logging is done is also playing with the head object in the data. But this is unrelated to dedupe.
So, but in any case, it is possible to do it even today, but it would require editing existing manifest, and it's not going to happen for this release. It's going to be on the follow-up feature.
Also, it will have it could have performance or latency implications. I mean, it would be more it would save more space, but the reason that the 4 megabytes are stored in the head objects are in order to save on another hop. So there are reasons for that. So it's not for sure that this will be used.
I mean, yeah, we can do it only if we decided that a dedupe is going to happen, but that would be a slower process because we'll need to break the source head object from the data, and then the destination, we need to chop them and reassign them. It's going to be more complicated, but it is doable. There's nothing stopping us by design from doing that.
Can I ask, this is only useful if the entire object is a duplicate, or whether certain chunks of it are either at set intervals or it's content sensitive as to?
No, it's a full object dedupe.
Okay.
And it's by doing full object, I'm taking advantage over the MD5 and SHA-256 that exist as e-tags on the object. So we don't need to read all the data in build table. We can just quickly get the MD5 and others attribute, build a much shorter tables, and when we decide something need to be deduped, only then we going to do any work. But if, for example, you have a setup with very little duplications, you're not going to see a lot of overhead paid by this thing.
Got it. Okay. Any other comments or questions on this item? All right, well, thank you. The next item is support S3 put bucket ownership controls to disable bucket object ACLs. Would anyone like to speak to that item?
Actually, I took this issue under my name right now. It came from like one of the requirement from our client early, but it's not a high priority for us at the moment. So if anybody else has the bandwidth, please feel free to take it. Just
can you expand on what it means?
so just this actually explain, is this like in AWS S3 spec? With this put bucket ownership control, it can actually disable. The description explains already, disable the bucket object ACL. I mean,
yeah, and disabled ACLs is actually the default on AWS regions other than US East 1. So I think real S3 compatibility, I think it is eventually important. And with the addition of the IAM accounts feature in Squid, gives us a lot more capabilities around IAM policies. And so the desire to just disable ACLs entirely and rely on bucket ownership and IAM policy, I think is closer to what users are doing in AWS.
All right. Further questions or comments on this particular item? All right, then. So the next item is next steps on tracing. And I see your account in the GitHub URL, Yuval.
Yeah, so there was quite a bit of effort around tracing or end-to-end tracing between the RGW and the OSD in Squid. So we have that in place, but we haven't taken any advantage of the fact that we can do end-to-end tracing and expanding on that. So I'm not sure what the priority of this is. There were some people interested in doing some work there, and therefore I kind of raised that as something that we should work on for the next release.
Hi, I'm one of the people working on things for the next thing, and I have a PR that I'm about to push. It does local tests, or it passes local tests. I just have to rebase because RBD did a bunch of changes. That switches everything over from Zipkin to not Jaeger. Well, Jaeger, but OpenTelemetry. That switches everything from Zipkin to OpenTelemetry, and adds a couple RGW traces. Some of them were originally, most of it was originally from Omri. I added a couple more traces of my own. As soon as I get out of the rebasement, I will push that. It's nothing spectacular, but it's a base that hopefully once we get into it, we can. It'll at least give us a good foundation to build more off of. The one change that I did make from Omri's original work is that rather than passing the trace context around by const pointer, I've been passing it around by, I switched to pass around by const reference. Since we already have the no-op context, I don't think having a special disjoint null pointer is valuable, and I'd rather just not have to worry about getting a null pointer when we're not expecting one. The other minor change I made is that we only expect JSPAN context between layering boundaries and pass JSPAN pointer otherwise. And this is actually recommended by OpenTelemetry because spans are heavier than events, and so we get better performance if we just have if we have few spans within if we like only create a span when we enter a layer, or like in a subsystem of a layer, like LC would be a good place to create spans, things like, or a given request would be a good place to create spans, things like that. And then use events everywhere else, because events are much cheaper and don't require the same kinds of allocations that spans do. Yeah, sorry, I made those two changes. It's otherwise based on Omri's work, but extended slightly. But it should be ready to merge as soon as I get, not merge. It should be ready to make a PR as soon as I get it rebased.
Thanks, Adam. This is great. So maybe I would add to that I mean, as Adam said, there's still some infrastructure work to do, but the way that I see that, tracing should be treated like debug logging, in the sense that it cannot be one person that writes all the traces in the system.
I agree.
So from my perspective, one of the big tasks would be to promote the feature, speak about the feature, explain about the feature, like in tech talks, and maybe code walkthroughs, so that people would adopt it and just use it. I think that especially given the... Sorry?
I said I agree. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so especially given the work done so far, and especially like even the extra work Adam is doing, the feature would be in a good enough state that people can just pick it up and use it. So that'd be one of my goals in the next release.
Casey, you have a hand raised.
Yeah, in terms of tracing, it's been kind of hard for me to know what things are useful to trace. And so my suggestion would be that, like, next time that we start doing some performance investigations or optimizations, we add specific traces in order to measure that, so that we know that they're in useful places.
I think that makes.
I suggested doing this for the D4N project because we're trying to optimize the caches. I think it would be really useful in multi-site also. And one thing that I forgot to mention in the multi-site section is that we have the C++ 20 coroutine prototype, and adding traces to that from the start, I think would be a really good way to kind of understand its performance, which is difficult at scale. So just other examples like that of finding useful ways to add traces rather than just kind of throwing them randomly at all of the request paths.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Another place, I mean, I have a PR, it's probably pretty stale, but another place that, or kind of areas where I think traces are useful are when operations are highly distributed. So for example, the traces were added to multi-part upload process specifically, so that if different parts are uploaded through different RGWs, we can still see one big trace of the entire process of uploading. And so this was done. Another place that is still kind of, as I said, like a pretty stale PR is to add traces to the bucket index log for multi-site, so that we can see the entire process of as one trace from the original operation on the object and all the way through the other side that fetch the object after they get the indication that they need to sync. So I agree with Casey that measuring latencies and performance is an important feature, but also functionalities that are highly distributed and difficult to figure out, you know, when they failed and so on, are also a good candidate for tracing.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's sort of what I'd been targeting when I added a couple. Like just what I've noticed, that we tend to have a lot of hard to find bugs in areas like where we back off and retry, or someone has something locked and we have to, or like, you know, things like that, the retry loops, things like that are rare conditions, but we actually have to have recovery logic for them. That's sort of been where I've been focusing on trying to add a little bit of extra tracing, just because it's historically been such a troublesome issue.
All right, anybody else on this particular topic? Okay, we'll go down to Lua hardening, and then I saw that I believe it was Casey added something up above, and we'll jump back to that in a moment. But as far as Lua hardening goes, would that be a Yuval topic?
Yes. So the idea is, so Lua scripting was added a while back, and we added functionality slowly to that. So this is not something, not a big topic, but it's a very risky feature. And if we want deployments to really adopt and enable it, or allow the users to use it, then there are a couple of steps that we need to take to make sure that people writing script are not really killing the RGW by doing that. So this is about the hardening. The one thing that was done, which is to prevent taking too much memory by the Lua code. We need to make sure that we don't take too much time or CPU. So if somebody is writing an infinite loop in Lua, then it will not block the RGW and eventually be killed. We need more sandboxing of the Lua script, so people cannot modify the operating system or the file system that the RGW is running on. And there's also the script management that needs to be much better for the feature to be really functional in real deployments. So this is really something that is kind of need to be done in order to make sure that, in order to enable deployments of Ceph to adopt the Lua scripting in a safe way.
All right. Anybody else have comments on Lua hardening?
So, other than a small list of like targeted changes, like how are you proposing to specifically do something like address infinite loops in Lua? Or is this just a list of blockers that are preventing people from using it?
Okay, so if the question is specifically on CPU and time that the script is taking, my approach, I haven't tried that, but generally my approach would be to use the Lua debug mechanism in order to make sure. So Lua debug, you can have a debug callback before and after every line of Lua code, so that I can measure how much CPU and time this specific VM is spending, and they're going to have like a limited budget, similar to how I give a limited budget of memory to each Lua VM. And if they exceed the budget, I'm just going to Lua VM, and that's it.
I understand. So, what kind of adversaries are you trying to address? Is this just like a non-malicious infinite loops, or someone who's deliberately trying to lock up the CPU because the debug interface is not adequate for doing that, for addressing the latter?
So the idea is to prevent from non-malicious. I mean, Lua scripting allows you to have access and to do all kind of malicious things against the data itself, which is even worse than doing bad things against the RGW. So my assumption is that only authorized people would be able to write Lua scripts, but even authorized people can make mistakes. So this is why I want to prevent the time, CPU, and memory, or to have limits on them.
Sure. I just want to give an example so you have it in mind where using the debug interface would be inadequate, and that's if you were to write, for example, a pattern to be matched against some string which has combinatoric behavior. You could easily just have that C function run basically till the end of the universe with the right pattern. So you wouldn't be able to handle lockups in that location, but yeah, for general Lua code, you could address that with VM bytecode counts or lines of code.
Yes, I understand. I mean, every time Lua calls into C code, whether it's our C code or the Lua C code, we have no control over that. So I agree. It's not a bulletproof solution, but hopefully it would address the issues where, just some admin wrote something and had a bug in the Lua script. So we don't want that to bring down the RGW.
Right. Currently, only the admin has access to enable Lua scripts and upload them. I don't think we have plans to allow arbitrary users to add scripts to their own buckets, for example.
Is that mostly because of the uncertainty surrounding the security of the scripts, or because it's just not considered useful?
I think it's mainly a matter of security. It could be useful for users to do a bucket. So there probably are use cases for that, but that would require a much tighter and mechanisms. So, I mean, maybe that should also be done, but we want to start with the basic, which is just admins doing Lua.
Yeah. If you did want to do that, it would probably require changes to the Lua code. Just as an example, you would probably not want to get rid of pattern matching in Lua in order to do the hardening to address CPU lockups, but you could modify the pattern matching to, for example, test whether or add a synthetic bytecode instruction to the debug so that you can kick yourself out of a pattern loop. That would be one way to address that, but you know, there would be a lot of changes required, and you would probably have to lock down the number of functions, the base level functions available to scripts, even more than you already do. But it would certainly be possible. I've written sandboxes that do similar things in the past.
Okay, yeah, probably in the future. I mean, when I said sandboxing, I meant just to, prevent file operations and stuff like that. Just not load those libraries.
All right. Is there anybody else who would like to speak to Lua hardening? Okay. In that case, why don't we jump up to, where was it here? Just above the zipper section, I think Casey probably added C++ 20 coroutine prototype for metadata sync. It included the design work, doc, and initial work. Would you like to say more about this, Casey?
I don't know. We've talked about it in the weekly RGW calls, and so we don't need to go too deep into it. But I did just remember that as a multi-site thing. If anybody's interested in getting involved, there's a lot of work to do, and it's organized in a way that we can split it up and work on it as a team.
Is the C++ 20 implementation of coroutines more accessible than what we have been using? The library we've been using?
Very, very, very much. It's the C++. One of the historical problems we've had with multi-site is that the implementation of coroutines is basically made out of preprocessor macros and case statements, and is horribly obnoxious to use, and has very specific requirements about where you can declare variables, and requires basically like lots of function classes that don't make any sense as function classes and things like that. And this basically gets rid of all of the stuff that was making that write-only code.
I mean, that's exciting because, there's that huge barrier to entry to working on
that huge barrier to entry, that huge barrier to debugging, and that it's one of our big flagship features. So like it's really, really important, and probably why one of the main reasons people use us, and also one of the most unpleasant parts to work on. So we need to fix that second part.
Very nice.
Yep, and if you're interested in the details of how the new coroutines are better than what we have, that's covered in the design doc under motivation.
Cool. Okay. Any other comments or questions on this particular topic? All right. Would anybody like to add anything anywhere at this point? All right, then. Is it how have things been handled in the past, Casey? Are people allowed to come back to this document and add to it if they are so motivated, or what's the general process?
So last year, I basically took what we added in this doc and put it in the upstream Trello backlog, but our Trello went away. And I think we're going to start using the Redmine tracker to track stuff like this. So I would say eventually we can try to turn these into tracker issues, but I don't know that we have decided on how to do that going forward. So whatever you think, we can figure it out.
That sounds fair. Okay. Anybody else before we close? All right. Well, thank you all very much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.